Welcome to the Calm Analytics channel. This is Boris Tizengauzen with you. Today is October 23rd, and we have a very packed episode with lots of news. So in this episode, Putin's nuclear tests have had the opposite effect. Ukraine is destroying Russia's largest oil refinery and factories, and sanctions against Lukoil and Rosneft are a direct blow to the very heart of the Kremlin. And Trump cancels his meeting with Putin, while India is winding down its purchases of Russian oil. And China is getting a wake-up call from Donald Trump. Maduro has pulled out Russian Igla systems and is preparing for war with the US. Meanwhile, Russian regions are drowning in debt. Teachers are getting their salaries cut, while propagandists are left wondering what was all this for. We'll talk about this and more in today's episode, including plenty of good news, which, let's admit, doesn't happen often. So Donald Trump cancels his meeting with Putin and imposes sanctions on the largest Russian oil companies. But Putin's methods remain unchanged. In any unclear situation, he threatens with nuclear weapons. After it became clear that the US didn't take the bait following the conversation between Putin and Trump, and even started tightening the screws with new sanctions, Putin demonstratively conducts nuclear tests. Moreover, pay attention to this interesting detail. Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabkov directly links these nuclear tests to the fact that the treacherous West refuses to make concessions to Russia. I quote, "NATO's aggressive policy has forced Russia to take compensatory military technical measures." He also commented that Russia will not allow NATO to drag it into a very costly arms race. Why has it suddenly become so expensive for Russia? What happened? But there's one nuance regarding the fact that Putin has now started making threats and conducted these nuclear tests. These tests are conducted annually and are a regular occurrence. Russia conducted them on October 26, 2022, October 25, 2023, and October 29, 2024. Basically, they do it every year at the end of October. So the attempt to link this and show that we're still a big deal, well, maybe Putin doesn't use the internet, but the rest of the civilized world does. And you can see that these are routine tests that Russia conducts every year. As for the new weapons that Putin boasts about, right now he's talking about the Yars, the Sineva, and the Sineva submarine, which by the way is more about Medvedev. Regarding the new weapons, I'd like to remind you of that epic address Putin gave to the Federation Council in 2018, when he claimed that Russia's warehouses are practically overflowing with the latest absolutely unparalleled weaponry. Let me remind you that at the time, Putin said that the Kinzhal hypersonic missile could not be intercepted by any air defense system. In Ukraine, Patriot systems have repeatedly shot down these missiles. Putin also said at the time that Russia has a terrifying missile, one with a nuclear-powered engine. It can supposedly fly endlessly, circling the globe for 1 billion years, striking everyone. This missile is called the Burevestnik. Well, about that endless flight. They've conducted more than 10 tests of the Burevestnik. At most, this missile stayed in the air for just a few minutes. And among other things, it crashed twice and caused quite serious damage. In one case, it fell into the sea. When they tried to retrieve it, the power unit exploded. 7 Russian nuclear scientists were killed by that explosion. In other words, Russian missiles, even before they are put on combat duty, still a long way off, are already starting to kill Russians. Can you imagine? That's the kind of peculiarity Russian weapons have. Now, about the Sarmat missile, which Putin also likes to brag about. So, Sarmat, they've conducted about 15 tests of this Sarmat, and not a single one was successful. And this time, Putin was launching some of these mock-ups of his from the Plesetsk Cosmodrome in the Arkhangelsk region. And when they tested the Sarmat at this same Plesetsk Cosmodrome, it exploded right in the silo, this Sarmat. It didn't just explode in the silo while it was being fueled, there was a huge crater left right where the launch pad used to be. I can only imagine how many Russians were killed there. Russian weapons never fail to live up to their main quality, killing Russians. So once again, they passed off routine tests as something supernatural, as some kind of response to NATO. And another important point, Ukraine has played a huge role in neutralizing Russian nuclear threats. First of all, Ukraine has violated practically every point of Russia's nuclear doctrine, and yet Putin hasn't used nuclear weapons. Secondly, Ukraine has openly humiliated Russia by striking part of its nuclear triad. Remember the brilliant Web operation, when strategic bombers, part of Russia's nuclear triad, were set on fire. And thirdly, Ukraine regularly demonstrates to the whole world that if you violate the points of Russia's nuclear doctrine, Putin won't use nuclear weapons because he's a coward. And let me remind you, the Russians even specifically changed their nuclear doctrine. They added a clause stating that if some country suddenly launches a large number of drones at Russia, then Russia will use nuclear weapons. Well, Ukraine does this regularly. And what, did the Botoxed pensioner use them? No. And every time Ukraine launches drones, and these drones encounter important Russian military industrial facilities. I can't just ignore this. And this episode is no exception. So the most effective and striking sanctions are those from the Magyar forces of Ukraine's drone systems, the main intelligence directorate of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, and the Security Service of Ukraine. Harvest time means a yield, and on this day, drones arrived at the Ryazan oil refinery. An important refinery, by the way. This refinery belongs to Rosneft, which is under sanctions, and within Rosneft, the Ryazan refinery is the largest, 14 million tons of processing capacity. So, what else is special about it? It supplies, among other things, fuel to the Moscow region. A big hello to Muscovites. And that's not all. The defense industry plant Sarmat in the city of Kopeisk was also attacked. That's in the Chelyabinsk region. Its importance lies in the fact that it produces and works with explosives for ammunition. Basically, it works at full speed for the Russian military-industrial complex. But also, what else is interesting? Just a day ago, a plant in Seltso was attacked. That's in the Bryansk region, the Bryansk chemical plant. It's exactly the same type of facility as the one in Kopeisk. So both plants are elements of the Russian military-industrial complex, working with explosives and components for ammunition. So there was an explosion there, the workshop collapsed. Here there was also an explosion, and there are already some casualties. Let me remind you, if anyone thinks they have a civilian profession working at a plant that produces explosives, which are then used to fill shells, mines, and even rockets that are later sent to Ukraine, don't be surprised if one day the lights in your workshop go out for good. And you, just like that. And you'll find yourself at Kobzon's concert in an instant. Because the armed forces of Ukraine will get to everyone. Take this plant in Kopeisk, for example, 1,800 kilometers from the front line. And even right at the front, Putin's situation isn't easy either. When does Putin start threatening with nuclear weapons? When things are bad at the front, when they're really bad. Why are things bad? Because on the front line, our defenders are showing steely will and heroism. Let me remind you, friends, that we have an important fundraiser for Azov, for the legendary Azov. We are raising money for the Azov Brigade's Special Forces sniper unit to get them reconnaissance drones. A set of reconnaissance drones combined with the skills of the Azov Brigade's Special Forces sniper unit is a nightmare, a real nightmare for Russians. Believe me. Our warriors from Azov have recorded a message for us. Please watch it.
Слава Україні! Ми загін снайперів спеціального призначення бригади Азов. Звертаємося до Бориса Тизенгаузена та його спільноти за допомогою. Для виконання спеціальних задач наш загін потребує розвідувальних дронів. Будемо вдячні кожному і кожній. Слава нації!
So, friends, let's help our Azov, and we're already almost at our goal. I think in a day or two, we'll close this fundraiser for our warriors. The link to the fundraiser is in the description of this video. There you'll find the details for Mono, Private, and PayPal for those who want to help from abroad. And to everyone, to each and every one of you, I want to say a huge thank you for supporting our warriors, for supporting Ukraine. If for some reason you don't see the payment details, maybe you're watching on another channel, look for the QR code. You can use it to access the fundraiser. And about that very thing, I didn't just randomly mention the Bryansk chemical plant. That's exactly where a Storm Shadow missile hit, and it turned the plant into one big burning torch. Why did this happen? Because the US lifted a key restriction on Ukraine's use of long-range missiles supplied by its allies. But it's not just about long-range missiles, let's put it that way. And this will allow the armed forces of Ukraine to strike deeper into Russia. In general, this also applies to the Storm Shadow missiles. The news came out literally just the other day, yesterday or the day before, that the US lifted a key restriction. But the restriction itself was lifted even before the meeting between Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky. That's why it became possible for this Storm Shadow missile to already hit the factory. You have to agree, a missile hitting a factory is much better than a drone hitting a factory. And the US expects that now Ukraine will carry out more massive attacks on Russia using various missiles that we have. The United States provided us with data, with intelligence, That's why they said navigation. That's why they said this is important. First, we'll lift restrictions here. Tomahawks we won't give yet, but we're lifting restrictions on all other missiles. So it's a good and important result. At the same time, the US, if they want, can still restrict the use of Storm Shadow, because they provide us with the targeting data. So in response, of course, Russia, how can we not recall the words of Russian officials like the alcoholic Medvedev, who said, if missiles hit us, yes, we'll immediately launch a nuclear strike. Where is it? Where is it? And generally, every time before a new type of weapon is supplied, Russia makes a similar statement. Let me remind you, they promised to use nukes before the delivery of HIMARS, before the delivery of F-16s, Storm Shadow, ATACMS, and so on. Word for word, it's always the same statement. By the way, I think they even have an algorithm worked out for this. A news report about a possible delivery. Then a telegram is printed out for Putin in some huge 500-point font. Some adjutant carries it to his office in a folder because Putin doesn't use the internet, remember? Putin reads this news, jumps up from the table, and runs down that giant Kremlin corridor in his 10-centimeter heels. It's not easy. He makes it to the Kremlin window, the one overlooking the inner courtyard. He opens the window and yells, "Diamond!" You know, that's when he needs to make threats. The Federal Protective Service, out in the courtyard, they grab Medvedev, who's building a pyramid out of bottles in the sandbox, drag him off to a shoot where they'll film him, and he'll say, "We'll hit them with nukes, that's it, it's the end for everyone." So that's basically the algorithm. Then they sit him down somewhere on a chair, write a post on social network X. Medvedev sits there fuming because his feet don't reach the floor, he's swinging his legs, tossing everything around, and instead of a pacifier, they give him a little bottle of booze and he calms down. I think that's the algorithm. But where is Medvedev, you might ask? And here he is. So, Medvedev stated that the war in Ukraine has turned from Biden's war into Trump's war. In other words, he went through the whole algorithm. They sat him down and told him, go ahead, write. I quote, Trump's cancellation of the Budapest summit, new sanctions against our country from the US. What else? There will be new weapons besides the notorious Tomahawks. The US is our adversary, and their talkative peacemaker, in quotes, has now fully set out on the path of war with Russia. Yes, for now he doesn't always actively fight on the side of Banderite Kyiv, but now this is his conflict, not the senile Biden's. The decisions that have been made are an act of war against Russia. Now Trump is in complete solidarity with crazy Europe, writes Medvedev while smacking his lips over that little bottle. All in all, whoa, whoa, as they say, the booze gladiator, take it easy, we're already scared. One might think that before this, Russia was going easy on us. That is, he went on to write that now, finally, we will be able to strike wherever we want, with all kinds of weapons, without worrying about unnecessary negotiations. But he should have said right away that the negotiations were unnecessary. Everyone understood that anyway. We will achieve victory. And cluck, 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 and woof, 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 says Medvedev. So yeah. In other words, the Russians kept insisting every time that they haven't even started yet, that they're going easy on us. It's the 4th year, and they still haven't started. That is, oil refineries are already burning on Russian territory, entire cities are being shut down, left without power in Russia, and yet they still haven't started. You know, this reminds me of childhood. Everyone probably knew a kid like this, who would get into a fight, get beaten up pretty badly, and then later tell everyone that he wasn't even fighting at full strength on purpose. And anyway, his right hand, his punching hand, was hurting because he fought Bruce Lee the day before. So there really was a kid like that. There he is, that kid. And it makes you want to ask Medvedev, why do this? His son lived and worked in the United States until they sent him back home, right? Probably studying the enemy up close. By the way, friends, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. First of all, your subscriptions really do help promote the channel, and secondly, more people will join us in our Ark of Sanity. And when the time comes to save humanity, those who are going to do it will say, okay, we need to save the most normal people. They'll say, so how do we do that? What's there to think about? They're all subscribed to the Tizengauzen channel. So those are the ones we'll save. So friends, make sure to subscribe. And by the way, don't forget to hit the bell and get your friends to subscribe too. Now, sanctions against Lukoil and Rosneft. That's actually really good. I criticize Donald Trump from time to time, but this is honestly a good, solid, confident move in the right direction. A little step, to give that Botox jellyfish a good kick in the rear. So they started with Lukoil and Rosneft. Immediately, Lukoil shares and Rosneft's shares sank to the bottom and just aren't coming back up. Plus, the European Union has approved the 19th package of sanctions against Russia. What's important in this package is that it includes almost 120, well, actually 117 tankers from the Shadow Fleet. There are also travel restrictions for Russian diplomats. This is important because a Russian diplomat is always a legalized Russian spy. Well, it's a legal residency, and so they don't wander around the Schengen zone, don't transport cash somewhere, don't move shady characters in their diplomatic cars. They're going to be restricted. Now, they'll have to stay where they're accredited. Plus, an important point, banks from Kazakhstan, Belarus, and companies from China and India are also subject to sanctions. This is also very important so that others are discouraged from helping Russians circumvent them. Sanctions, and in addition, there's a ban on the supply of liquefied natural gas to the European Union. And another important thing, a complete ban on all crypto services for Russians. This too, in other words, essentially, they're now using crypto to solve their financing issues. Very good. Now, about Lukoil. Somehow, despite it being the 4th year of the war after the full-scale invasion, Lukoil's assets and entire networks of gas stations were operating perfectly well in Europe. About half a year ago, I did an episode on this, and people wrote to me in the comments, yes, we have them here. Here in our country, there's an entire network, a whole chain of gas stations, networks of gas stations, and so on, operating. In some countries, Lukoil sold its assets, while in others, it simply disguised itself under different brands. And now I need your help again. I'd like to update the information in which countries Lukoil is still operating. Of course, after these sanctions, they're quickly doing some kind of rebranding or an effective sale, or maybe even a real sale, but such assets can't be sold that fast. So I need your help. I know for sure that there are viewers from all over Europe. I have in the comments, and it will be very helpful for me. This is very useful information. Before the full-scale invasion, before the annexation of Crimea, Lukoil was operating. Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Finland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Croatia, North Macedonia, Montenegro, Italy, and the Baltic countries. Obviously, they left many of these countries, and in some places they just rebranded. For example, in Finland it's called Toboil, and in the Czech Republic, Jet. Well, at least that's the information I have. This is what I found in open sources. Now, currently, Lukoil remains, if we go by open sources, in Belgium and Luxembourg. The Netherlands as well, strangely enough. Maybe it's a mistake, but according to open sources, Lukoil is present in the Netherlands. Lukoil. And that's after all the downed planes. Bulgaria, Romania, Serbia, Croatia, North Macedonia, and Montenegro. Where else are they present? And are they present in the countries I just listed? I kindly ask you, please write in the comments. I need this for my other kind of work. And here, interesting things are happening. In Europe, strange coincidences are happening with oil refineries. With oil refineries that process Russian oil. In Bratislava, there's an incident at a plant owned by the Hungarian company MOL, which processes Russian oil. Well, and before that, just recently, there were explosions at Hungary's largest oil refinery, and also at a refinery in Romania owned by Russia's Lukoil. What's going on? Somewhere there was a technical issue, some kind of mishap happened. According to the official statement in Romania when the explosion occurred, the official statement said that the explosion was caused by the accumulation of gases that formed as a result of waste leaking into the pipeline inspection channel. One worker was injured there. When I read about it, you know what it reminded me of? The Men in Black, but the local version. Like the light reflected off Venus, hit a methane gas bubble, and that's how it all happened. But what's happening with Russian, or more precisely, with the plants that process Russian oil? What kind of misfortune is this? I don't know, but there is good news. The ban on importing Russian liquefied natural gas. Another piece of good news, it was supposed to come into effect in 2027, but it was moved up by a year. So Austria, Hungary, and Slovakia have already withdrawn their objections and have promised not to block the sanctions. And why was Austria blocking it? They wanted theirs to be. Raiffeisen Bank pulled out 2 billion euros that were frozen in Russia, but they were told, let's not mess around, join the sanctions. And they refused that particular demand. Well, since you don't mess around with American sanctions, that's the news we have. Indian refineries are preparing for a possible reduction in purchases of Russian oil due to new US sanctions. Reuters reports that there will be a large-scale reduction. So basically, some private Indian companies are planning to reduce or completely stop purchases from Russia. Before US sanctions were imposed, India decided to play it smart. They were reducing purchases of Russian oil for state-owned refineries and almost proportionally increasing purchases for private ones. But now there's no way around it. With the US sanctions in place, state-owned refineries are also reviewing their trade documents with Russia to make sure, God forbid, there are no direct deliveries, especially from companies like Neft and Lukoil. Of course, now Russia will try to circumvent these sanctions, maybe sell in a different way, and will need more and more shadow fleet tankers, which are increasing in number. They're being driven under sanctions. In general, they're tightening the screws, tightening them more and more, not hitting them right on the bald head yet, but squeezing pretty hard. And Trump announced next week that he wants to talk to Xi Jinping in South Korea so that China stops buying Russian oil. Well, that's Trump for you. Let's see. Let's wait for these things to happen after all. But at the very least, sanctions against Lukoil and Rosneft are already significant. Maduro has just announced that Venezuela has deployed at least 5,000 Russian Igla-S anti-aircraft missiles to counter the United States. Maduro, aren't you overestimating yourself a bit there? One wants to ask. Well, let me remind you, the US is fighting against the trafficking of illegal substances, striking at boats and submarines, including those transporting these illegal substances. But Maduro thinks that under this pretext they want to come after him and deal with him. It's actually a perfect moment to deal with Maduro, by the way. Why is it perfect right now in particular? Because Putin is bogged down in the war in Ukraine and he can't help Maduro at the moment. Although, in theory, he should have. He should have, in theory. In theory. But that's exactly why Putin can't do anything right now. He won't be able to do anything. He's busy here. Right now, he needs to deal with the front lines, with negotiations, with new sanctions. That's exactly why he couldn't do anything when Assad's regime was being overthrown. Remember that? Absolutely nothing from Russia. All Putin could do was put Assad up somewhere in Moscow. Putin just sat there, I think, like a bald snail, watching from his bunker, peeking out to see where Assad was, whether he was flying over here. You know what that's like? A Soul of the Scarlet? Is Assad's pink ship flying in on those sails? Maduro simply doesn't quite understand that there are enough people in the country who hate him in Venezuela, because, according to various estimates, ever since this absolutely idiotic regime, Maduro has completely wrecked the economy, there's hyperinflation, and about 10 million people have left the country. That is, it's not necessary to fly directly at these Russian systems. Igla-S. Let me remind you, these systems are designed to shoot down low-flying aircraft. But you don't have to fly low or even fly at all, and you don't have to use planes. Let Maduro carefully study the history of the Iranian General Soleimani and how American drones arrived after Trump's order, by the way, and how they literally vaporized the second most powerful man in Iran who, among other things, was responsible for coordinating with Iranian terrorist proxy groups such as Hamas and Hezbollah. In other words, Putin right now, to put it mildly, has no time for his friends. So Maduro, whether you deploy those needles or not, if something comes your way, I'm afraid you won't even see it. And now, some wonderful news. Putin will not go to South Africa for the G20 summit. The Kremlin will announce who will head the Russian delegation. So what's up with that? What happened? What's going on? Putin, who used to stand in the center of every G8 and G20 photo, grinning smugly, standing there on those heels of his. But what about now? What? And now, some news about sanctions and priorities in Russia, about how sanctions are supposedly benefiting Russia. That's what Russian officials have been saying. So, here's the main news about priorities. Russian regions have entered the deepest budget crisis in decades, and the situation is only going to get worse. I can't help but smile at news like this. I hope you don't mind. According to Ukrainian intelligence, the Arkhangelsk region, with an annual budget of, attention, 156 billion rubles, currently has only 50 million left. The Volgograd region has 100 million left, and Belgorod has 200 million. So basically, in places where the budgets are in the billions, there's barely a tiny bit left. In other regions, the situation is also not very good. Because of the budget crisis, Russian regions are being forced to cut spending on education and healthcare. Well, what can you do? It's just not a priority. In 12 Russian regions, teachers' salaries have been reduced. By the way, it's already started on Russian propaganda channels. They're testing the waters for a freeze of the war along the current front line. So the question is being raised, why do we even need more dozens and dozens of square kilometers of scorched land with piles of bricks? Where are we supposed to find billions to rebuild all of that later? They're already floating these ideas, putting them out there. Yeah, we don't need that. Yeah, let them rebuild it themselves. I recently came across a Russian propagandist who kept insisting, but how, he says, are we supposed to stop the crisis that's already rolling in like a tsunami? Those damned Ukrainians will have the whole world supporting and rebuilding them. And we'll have to deal with our own swamp ourselves. We'll be wrapping up our Russian swamp with blue electrical tape, patching up the economy of this swamp. And more clearly, the question is being asked, what was all this for? And also, while I was recording this video, news came in that the Senate committee approved a bill to recognize Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism. All of this for the kidnapped children. In yesterday's episode, I showed a horrifying video where Putin's aide admitted on camera that she had kidnapped a Ukrainian teenager. There you have it. Deal with the consequences. So what does this recognition mean for the Russian Federation? In other words, if this bill is passed, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio will have to present a report to the senators on the return to Ukraine of more than 19,000 children who were illegally deported. After the initiative comes into force, there will be 60 days for this to happen. If they are unable to confirm the return of all these children to their homes in Ukraine, Russia will be officially designated as a state sponsor of terrorism. By the way, Senator Lindsey Graham, the same Senator Lindsey Graham of ours, for which he deserves special thanks, this initiative is his. Currently, the countries designated as state sponsors of terrorism are Iran, North Korea, Cuba, Sudan, and Libya. A fine company, I think, for Putin and the Russian Federation. Well, friends, take care of yourselves, take care of your loved ones, and subscribe to this channel. And let's help our legendary defenders from the 1st Azov Corps. Let me remind you, the donation details are in the description of this video. Wishing us all a peaceful day, and glory to Ukraine.